What is up, everybody? I hope you're all doing well today, and welcome back to Last Epoch. This week, I have a brand new build for you, or at least new to me, the Hand of Judgment Paladin. This build is very fun. It's gotten me all the way up into the level 100 empowered monoliths. It's been fairly tanky. It dishes out pretty solid but very consistent damage. It's definitely not like a roll up and one-shot things, but the level of sustain, both in sustaining your own health and in the sustained output of damage, has been quite fantastic, and it's just been a really good time. It's been a very smooth build. I've had a lot of fun doing it. So, I'm sure you pieced together from watching the little intro clip, but I will give you a brief breakdown of how this build works. So, we won't go into all the gear yet, but I will show you the one item that makes this build work. That is the Hand of Judgment, a legendary or unique pair of gloves that does as follows: 3 melee damage per attunement for judgment while unarmed. Unarmed meaning you have no weapon. You can still use a shield offhand, all that, just can't use a weapon. 2% increased area per attunement for judgment while unarmed. A mana cost reduction for judgment. A flat amount added to attunement, which is the primary scaling factor for all of our damage and AoE. 60% increase cooldown recovery speed for judgment. The way I have it set up, this stat doesn't really matter. And then a fire penetration. Mine is at 12%. It can roll anywhere from 8 to 24. So we'll talk a little bit more about this item and gear and stuff later, but for now, that is just the brief rundown of what it does. So essentially, you start scaling the judgment skill with attunement rather than your base weapon. Now, this scaling does get pretty solid. It makes it so that you can scale both the on-hit damage of the attack and also the consecrated ground after, which already scales with attunement, but now you can scale it with the on-hit as well. So it just lets attunement be an overall AoE and damage addition to this skill, along with the cooldown and raw stat. So essentially this build revolves around cruising around the map with shield charge, as you saw me doing, and smashing things with judgment, and then letting the consecrated ground afterwards do a lot of the damage. I have tried building this for on-hit damage and also using and taking advantage of the damage over time via the consecrated ground, which is all this damage going on after the initial hit. I did see a lot of potential in using it as an on-hit, which we'll talk about when we look at the skills. Especially early on, I was having trouble maintaining the mana cost. It is a very mana-hungry skill, so I did have a lot more luck just worrying about the overall damage of the consecrated ground rather than the on-hit. Any additions to the on-hit is wonderful and nice, but it's not what we're building around. And then, while in consecrated ground, you gain a lot of HP. We have a lot of buffs going on, so you have a lot of button presses. You use whatever button you put it on to pop up Sigils of Hope, which has a lot of damage and sustain boost. You do get a chance to have these auto cast when you make a kill, but it is only a 6% chance on kill, so not the most reliable. And so for bosses, you're still going to end up having to press the Sigils of Hope button to pop that up. And then you can also press to do the doubling effect on Holy Aura. So it can be a little button intensive, but for most of the just running around doing monoliths, you may end up pressing whatever button for Sigils of Hope a little bit, but you will very rarely need to do a lot of button combos. So it's a lot of just cruising around with shield charge and judging things. It's a lot of fun. But now that you've seen how the build works, let's actually go in and look at all of these skills. So shield charge is here as my movement skill of choice, along with a little extra damage. There's really not a whole lot going on here, so we'll just very quickly run through this. We come over here, take the maximum mana efficiency just to make it not add to our already troublesome mana costs. We roll down here, increase the damage, and then we take the no longer requires a shield. You do not have to take this whatsoever, especially as I am using a shield, so I don't need this. I had it early on because I was using a catalyst and I just never bothered to change it. This is basically just here as a movement skill. Set it up however you please. Over here I have some final hit area and damage, just so that the actual ending of the skill is quite a large blast. I could set it up for more damage. I'm not really using it as such or scaling it, so again, it's just a movement skill. Do whatever you want. The primary skill, Judgment, I have changed quite a few times. I have tried it as the aura around yourself. I have tried the on hit with the extra physical and fire pen, taking away consecrated ground and an auto casting smite. I do see potential in using this as they build, but as I said, I had trouble with mana costs. I just couldn't quite pull it off, especially in the early levels. I might try switching it again at some point just to try and scale it for on hit. But for now, in my setup here, we are not using this. So we come up here and we take all 4 points into Sanctified Serenity. Consecrated Ground has increased healing effectiveness up to 100%. Now this skill reads as follows. A powerful melee attack that leaves an area of consecrated ground for 4 seconds. Allies in the consecrated ground, including yourself, are healed for 50 health each second. Enemies in consecrated ground take fire damage over time that scales with spell damage. Very important. Consecrated ground gains 1 spell damage per 5 increased healing effectiveness. Now what this does is let you both scale your healing with your damage of the consecrated ground. Very important, very, very nice. Now this skill does have a light strength scaling, and then it has the attunement scaling for damage, both the on hit, and then the attunement adds healing effectiveness, which also scales the consecrated ground. So down below here it specifies added melee damage applies to the attack, which is the initial hit, at 350% effectiveness. Quite a nice scaling, but again, not what we're doing this time. Added spell damage applies to consecrated ground at 225% effectiveness per second. So it's fairly solid. You get a lot of damage out of spell damage. The melee attack's damage does not scale with spell damage, and consecrated ground's damage does not scale with melee damage. So you do have to focus on what you're going to be building, whether it's the melee and on hit or the consecrated ground and spell damage, dot style damage, that's all it is. The gloves do add the attunement scaling to the actual damage on hit. The scaling tags are a little misleading because it says fire, spell, melee, damage over time, area, strength, and attunement. Without the Hand of Judgment gloves, the melee hit would only scale with fire, melee, area, and strength, and then the consecrated ground would be the spell, damage over time, and attunement. It kind of separates the two. The gloves let us scale both with attunement, which is quite nice, and the area, of course. So it's a little bit of a weird skill, and if you don't read it carefully, it is a little bit of a confusing skill, but it's really not that bad. Just think more attunement is better, spell damage increases the dot of the consecrated ground, which does count as a damage over time for the scaling tags and just your general stats. So damage over time and fire damage over time will affect this, along with fire damage, spell damage, and then the attunement scaling. Alright, so now that we got that out of the way, moving on. So we take all the healing effectiveness for a lot of spell damage. We stick 2 points in Divine Destruction. Judgment hits and consecrated ground deal more damage against high health enemies, which is 65% health and above. This isn't crazy important, but it is some nice extra damage right out the gate. And it is nice for the on-hit portion, as most of the time when you go to cast Judgment, they will be at high health anyways. So this does give you a very consistent damage buff to the hit-on-hit portion. Then we're going to take Pious Offering. Judgment now also consumes a percentage of your current mana and deals more damage per mana consumed. So 20%, if you're at 100 mana, you use this, it will take 20 extra mana on top of whatever cost it has going on, and you will get more damage at a rate of 3% more damage for every 2 mana. This is quite nice. We only take 1 point in it, as again, this is a very mana hungry skill, and I'm trying to cast it as much as possible. Then we take a point or two, depending on your setup, into Deliverance. Deliverance, just on hit for however many seconds, gives you a 50% health and mana regen boost. This is just nice to recoup as much of that mana used as possible. And then the skill normally has a cooldown. We go up here and take Urgent Inquisition. Judgment no longer has a cooldown, but costs substantially more mana. Its mana cost now counts as mana consumed for the effect of the Pious Offering node, so the mana used here for the base cost also affects this as well. And then having it no cooldown allows us to cast Judgment multiple times in a row, which is very, very nice for boss damage. Again, it makes the mana cost hard to maintain, but Consecrated Ground can stack. You can cast multiple Judgments at once and have multiple Consecrated Grounds hitting an enemy per second. So you can rack up a lot of damage doing this, especially on a boss that doesn't move around a lot. So that is very nice. Then we take 1 point in Sacred Sword. Judgment hits have a chance to ignite enemies, and ignites applied by Judgment have additional fire pen. Not important, even though we might end up with some extra dot damage just because of the base scaling for Consecrated Ground. Not very important, we only put the 1 point in. We take all 3 points into Swift Verdict. Judgment has a shorter cooldown and a lower mana cost. This might sound counterintuitive because of the Pious Offering node giving us more damage per mana used, but it is hard to keep up with mana costs, as I've said repeatedly, so you definitely want to take all the points in this just to make it so you can cast it repeatedly as quickly as possible, and then not lose your whole mana pool and be sitting around with your shield in hand. Then we move down here, take all 4 points in Flaming Soul. Consecrated Ground deals more damage at max stacks. This is 100%. And then the last couple points, you will be taking Purifying Flame. Judgment hits and Consecrated Ground deal more damage against ignited enemies. Not bad, not a massive boost, but it's just there as a filler. Then we come up here, Warrior's Tithe. Judgment melee attacks heal you and nearby allies for each enemy hit. Not a big deal, just a little extra on-hit healing. The most important note here, Prophesied Immolation. Judgment's melee attack cannot be dodged and deals more fire damage based on your increased healing effectiveness. Now this is quite nice. Fire damage per 10 increased healing effectiveness is 1%. Now this means that you get a more, which is a multiplying damage bonus, for also scaling the healing effectiveness, which again applies to the Consecrated Ground. Now this adds a lot of damage to the on-hit because you will already be scaling a lot of healing effectiveness for the Consecrated Ground portion of the skill, and now this will turn around and give you damage back to the actual on-hit. So even though we're not focusing on the on-hit, this does give you quite a damage boost, which is really nice for just eliminating smaller non-tanky mobs, which is really cool because you don't have to sit around and wait for the dot damage effect to kill things. You kind of just slam, drop the smaller enemies, and then move on. And when you're fighting tankier targets, elites, bosses, and whatnot, that's when we really make use of the dot damage that you can stack. Now, as you can see, just before we get to the gearing, I do have 1 extra point to spend through a relic, which I'll show you in the gearing portion. If you do not have the +2 skills, I would drop 1 point from the Deliverance node, just because it's not a huge deal, so you'll have 1 second of the extra regen instead of 2. Not a massive difference, this is just a quality of life node, so if you really can't get that 1 extra skill point, then I would drop a point here, as this is fairly unimportant. Helpful, but not mandatory. Alright, so that was the big one. Then we come over here to Holy Aura. We take all into the elemental resistances and endurance. This is just nice, extra tankiness, helps you clear up a lot of your elemental resistances without having to stack it throughout all your gear. Lets you use idle slots for damage instead of just resists. Quite nice, we fill that out fully at 5 points. Then we take 3 into the Vital Boon, which is your health regeneration at 30%, 3 out of 4 points. So then we take Purification, which grants a passive poison resistance of 20%. Not a huge deal, but it is nice to get a little extra poison resist without working for it. And then On activation, your Holy Aura will now also cleanse ailments. And then up here, Holy Aura grants you and your allies increased healing effectiveness. This is just a 4 points for 40% more healing effectiveness. Get that spell damage for the consecrated ground. Then we work our way up here to Rhea's Devotion. Holy Aura grants you and allies a chance to ignite. Not a big deal, we take the 1 point. Then we come up here, the Fury. Holy Aura causes you and allies to penetrate enemy fire resistance. Both points for 10%. Not bad, but it helps with damage. Then up here, Burning Blows. Holy Aura grants you and allies increased fire damage. All points in this get that 50% increased fire damage. And that is it for Holy Aura. If you were to, again, lose that 1 point, I would probably say maybe drop 1 point in the health regen. If you get a lot of resists on gear, you could drop 1 from the elemental resistances. I like to have this filled though, so I'd drop the point if I had to in the health regen. Next we have Sigils of Hope, which will have a chance to cast upon killing an enemy. For bosses, you'll be pressing this yourself, as I said earlier. First, we come over here and take Empowering Sigils, all 5 points. Damage granted per sigil, 25%. Just makes you do more damage. Then we take the 1 point in Last Wish. Chance to summon sigil when you kill an enemy, 6%. Again, it helps through sustaining the sigils through monoliths and whatnot, but you'll still have to manually cast for bosses. Then down here, we take all 5 points and Invigorate. Sigils grant you and allies increased healing effectiveness. These are quite nice, so every sigil gives you another 30% healing effectiveness, which is more spell damage for the consecrated ground. Then we take all points into Quiet Mind. Sigils of Hope cost less mana. This is quite nice as it is a fairly expensive skill, and with all the other mana issues, we want it to not cost very much for when we have to manually cast it. Then we take the 1 point in Polygram. You now have 1 more sigil for a maximum of 4. Then over here, Iron Sigils, we put 2 points for the endurance threshold per active sigil, plus 30, so every sigil, 30 more endurance threshold. And then we take the last 2 points in Enduring Hope. Sigils last longer, 4 more seconds. This just helps keep them up longer, and through monoliths and just blasting mobs, this also helps you hold on to your sigils longer to make sure the uptime is higher because, they'll last longer. Very simple. This is just a lot of extra buffs. Nothing insane here. I do recommend for sure taking the Invigorate, Empowering, and Last Wish. Everything else you can kind of adjust however you please. I do find this to be my preferred setup though. I've messed around with these a little bit, rolling in for the melee damage, fire damage, and whatnot, but for me, this was my preferred setup. And then the last skill, which I can actually thank my buddy who is also playing this build currently for this little tip. So for a while, I was running Rebuke in order to have a just mana regen buff and a little bit of extra tankiness, to avoid one-shots from bosses. But I wanted more damage, and he showed me and explained to me a little something extra. So Healing Hands, by default, heals all allies in a target area for 100 health and applies a Lingering Warmth, which heals 80 health over the next 3 seconds. The Lingering Warmth cannot stack. I looked at this skill one time, read the tooltip, and said, I don't need a press button healing skill, I'll be fine. But this skill is a lot more than meets the eye. So when you take Cleric's Hammer, when you directly use a melee attack and hit at least one enemy, you have a chance to cast Healing Hands around the target. This consumes mana based on Healing Hands mana cost, and it restores up to a certain amount of health, yada yada. When you take all 4 points in this, you lose out on some of the healing and the mana consumption goes up. We can definitely fix that though. But this means every time you hit something with Judgment, you will also cast Healing Hands. Now when we move along, you'll see why this is helpful. Then you take Searing Light. Healing Hands now hits enemies within its area of effect, dealing spell fire damage. Added spell damage applies at 200% effectiveness. So this lines up with all the other stats we're trying to scale because of Consecrated Ground, and now makes it add damage, and you auto-cast it when you hit with Judgment. So this is a lot of extra damage for basically nothing, but using up another slot. So after making it do damage here, we move down, we take 1 point in the Purity of Thought, which is a max of 1, mana cost -5. As you can see, it now costs 0. We take all 3 points. Blessed Perish, Healing Hands has increased area of effect and lower mana cost. So now we just cast this for free. It's fantastic. Then we take Prayer of the Fallen, Healing Hands has increased healing effectiveness. This is really not a big deal, as this healing effectiveness only applies to the healing from the skill, not effectiveness towards Consecrated Ground, but either way we have 2 points there. Then over here we take Vow of Restoration, Healing Hands restores additional health over time. This lasts for 3 seconds, just like the Healing Hands inherent healing over time effect. So this just adds to the passive regen after having casted it. Lots of regen just means we tend to not fall over very easily. So after we've taken these nodes, we come down here. Cleric's Wrath, Healing Hands deals more damage based on the combined levels of your specialized buff skills. This is just more damage added, take both points, no questions there. Then I take the Virtue of Patience, Healing Hands takes longer to cast, but deals more damage. We're auto-casting it, who cares if it's a little slower, and has increased healing effectiveness and a larger area of effect. So this just makes it hit more enemies at once and do more damage. Then up here, we take Bane of Evil, Healing Hands deals additional spell damage based on your increased healing effectiveness and on increased healing effectiveness from this tree. So this is just nice. This node over here applies to this damage, and then we just add more spell damage to this part of the hit that we would already have been scaling for Consecrated Ground. And because I had extra points, we took both Halted Scourge and Turn Undead. Halted Scourge, Healing Hands immobilizes void enemies for 1 second on hit and deals more damage to them, and then grants you a less void damage taken. Not bad, nice little extra buff. And then Turn Undead, Healing Hands fears undead for 2 to 3 seconds on hit and deals more damage, grants you 10% less necrotic damage taken. This is quite nice, not a huge deal, but it's a little more damage mitigation and a little more damage to at least a good chunk of enemies you fight. So overall, this skill set works very well together. I love auto-casting skills, and adding the Healing Hands in just adds a lot more damage to my judgment casts without costing me a thing. And as I said, I was using Rebuke before, which was good, but this has added a fair bit of on-hit damage and has been quite nice. It's definitely improved my damage, probably by maybe a fifth more damage, I'd say, maybe loosely. It's hard because the skill does not, at least for me, show the damage per second. It doesn't even guess. So I've roughly tried to watch the numbers pop up, and it looks like it's hitting around 2 to 4k depending. Really hard to say because there's a lot of damage numbers popping up all the time, but I did notice a difference when fighting elites and more tanky mobs, that I was blasting them a fair bit better after taking this and setting it up like so. So I definitely recommend it. Alright, so let's briefly talk gear before we move on to the passives and then wrapping up the video. So obviously your most important piece of gear is the Hand of Judgment. I got mine with legendary potential and was able to slam on 110 endurance threshold. Not a massive deal. I'm not heavily scaling endurance threshold, but it is helpful and it does protect that last third, maybe quarter of my health, give or take. Not bad. You'll see my health bounce around, but we have so many different heals that I very rarely go down. So the key things to look at when you either pulled this item, because it does drop fairly commonly, it does only require level 24, so you can start playing this build fairly early on. But there's a couple things I want you to look out for when looking at the rolled stats on your piece of gear. The most important parts, being the melee damage and increased area, do have a flat number, being the 3 and the 2%. That will not change. That is always how this item drops. The judgment mana cost, while unarmed, you definitely want to find a higher roll if possible. It rolls from -12 to -8. I only got a 9, so your mana issues could become a lot less negative than mine if you manage to get like a 10 to 12 on this mana cost. It won't change the whole build, but it will make it a lot more convenient. I simply took this one as is because of getting the legendary potential on it and getting some higher rolls elsewhere. Being the next stat up, which is the attunement, 4 to 16. This one rolled a 15. So I took it and ran because that is a pretty solid flat attunement added to the build on one item. I like it. I definitely would say, unless the other stats are just fantastically rolled, I would not recommend using one of these if it's maybe 10 or below. Try to get above 10 with the flat attunement. You get a lot out of attunement. Between me and my buddy testing this build, the attunement is easily the most important scaling part of this build. And then the increased cooldown recovery speed for Judgment, mine rolled very high. This is not important to me as I take that specific node that makes it remove the cooldown. If you wanted to try, say, not using that and rely on it being a cooldown, or just shift things up and use another skill as your primary damage dealer and then follow this up as a big hit, and you didn't make it a no cooldown skill, you'd want to look for a high increased cooldown recovery. Mine, it doesn't matter, but it is rolled very high. And then the fire pen. The fire penetration is not great on mine, but it isn't the lowest either, so it's okay. I would have loved to have seen this at the 15 or above. Mine is at 12, it rolls 8 to 24. That is another one that can make a big difference if you get a higher fire pen roll. Try to get all of these as high as possible, or at least if all of your stats are in the upper 50% of their rolls, I would consider that fairly good. And then I want to make this build guide a little bit faster than my previous one, as that ended up being almost 52 minutes long or something like that. So I'm not going to go over every single stat. I'll just kind of give you what I'm looking for, what I'm doing. So I am using block as one of my main defenses, so I do have a shield with an extra block chance, good stats on it. I just chose a base with a high block chance, increased healing effectiveness. I'm currently using the increased fire damage and endurance, threshold and scaling, helmet and chest. What you're looking for is attunement, increased armor, increased health. You have a lot of healing, so more health is a bigger pool to survive with and then heal back very easily. You have no problems healing extremely quickly with this build, so health goes a long way. Increased armor also helps a lot, as just armor negates damage dealt to you, so it makes it a lot easier to not get one-shotted and then be able to heal all the damage back. For damage stats, you're looking for attunement, spell damage, increased fire damage over time, just fire damage, raw fire damage. A little bit of attack speed is nice just for the convenience of casting Judgment quickly. Not mandatory though. I have an okay amulet I've had for a long time. Increased health regeneration is also kind of nice. And then just trying to get your resists up. Now that I've glanced over all that gear, my relic is the other kind of interesting piece. It is the Code of the Erased Sentinel, which is the Weaver's Will unique item, which means that it has a bunch of stacks, and then as you kill enemies, it will essentially level up the item and then randomly roll different affixes on the item for you. Its base is a +1 to Sentinel skills, which is just everything, increased armor, and then a % of armor mitigation also applies to damage over time, which is nice because I am guilty of not always capping my poison resist. This makes poison do less damage to me and kind of makes up a bit of that difference. On my random rolls, I gained a little mana regen, which is nice, +1 to rebuke along with the 7% increased armor that comes with it, and then a tiny bit of health. The base item grants 12 mana and -3 melee attack mana cost. I'm sure you could craft a much better relic. This one has just been very solid, and I like the +1 to skills along with the negate 3 mana for melee attacks, which does apply to Judgment. I might, as I go forward with this build, if I keep playing it, I might try to buy off the market a bunch of these Code of the Eraseds until I get better rolls on the affixes for them. All of the base stats we've talked about will be what you're looking for here. Attunement, health, mana regen, dot damage, fire damage, all that fun stuff. The stats really aren't that complicated. It's just trying to get a lot of them. And that didn't take too long, so now we'll quickly look at my idols. I have a 3 slaughter with increased damage over time and increased armor. I have increased healing effectiveness and block effectiveness, both very useful for me. Increased healing effectiveness and fire pen with melee attacks, not super important, but it does help us get a little more damage off the initial hit. And then it is health regen, fizz resistance, stun avoidance, and a little health, not a big deal. Some vitality and poison resist. Health regen physical, damage over time and poison, and then a mostly useless but 44 increased fire damage over time. There's obviously room for improvements in the idols. Nothing is minimaxed, and as I said, I am fairly easily clearing non-corrupted scaled, but the level 100 monoliths, I'm cruising through them fairly comfortably, not having any major issues. I think I've died once so far because I wasn't paying attention. And that covers it for the gear. All I'm really looking for now is just getting exalted items with high tier 6 or 7 rolls in the stats I need, and then just filling in the stats around them. Gearing is going to be very different for anyone. The only major things I'd recommend is get a high block chance, fill out your resists, try to get good rolls on your Hand of Judgment because you do base a lot of your build on that. If you happen to get one, or if you choose to buy one, the Code of the Erased seems like it could be fairly nice. Just pay attention to what affixes it rolls. And then I'm using the opal rings for the cooldown recovery. Not important there, but the +1 or 2 to all attributes is quite nice, just getting a little extra attunement along with increased armor from strength and yada yada from the other ones. You don't necessarily need to have the opal rings. I just like them because I'm trying to build as much attunement as I physically can. And then that actually ends it for the gear. Now we will look at the passive tree, which I have not looked at in a while, so I'm hoping there's not anything too funky going on in here to embarrass myself with. To start out, I have the max strength, which strength isn't particularly important, but I do love getting a lot of fire and void resist. Then we take 1 point in vitality and increased health regen so that we can take stalwart, which is a flat 3% block chance along with some block effectiveness. And then we put 10 points into the relentless, increased damage and stun avoidance. And that's it for the basic sentinel tree. And then before we get into the big one, I'll show you why I have the 1 point in void and forge guard. Void Knight, I took 1 point in here for some void and physical resistance along with some health. I can probably drop these now if I wanted to. Early on, I just took it to fill some resists in that I needed. And then the Forge Guard is an important point for the flat 2% block chance, and then a little block effectiveness. Past that, we don't really take anything here. I don't think there's even a block chance early on in the Void Knight tree. Yeah, see, I don't see any. So 1 point here you probably won't need based on your gear. I could probably drop it now, whatever. Moving into the actual Paladin tree, we will fill out all of Conviction, increased physical, fire, and lightning damage, along with, at max, 16% fizz, fire, and lightning pen. This is very good, all the points in here. And then Defiance, Attunement, and Elemental Resistances, all 8 points please, and thank you. Then we take 1 point for the flat block chance, block effectiveness, and stun avoidance. Then after that we move up here to Heaven Fire. You have additional spell damage while you have a shield. Now if you were trying to run this with a offhand catalyst, or whatever they call it, instead of a shield, you would probably want to move these points maybe over here into the health and healing effectiveness. I will probably eventually dump points in here if I end up with extras. It is just a 5% effectiveness at a time though, so I did not get crazy dumping the points in here. I found other uses for them, but if you're not using a shield, this would definitely be a node worth putting points in. Then after that, we take all of the 7 points in Holy Icon, increased healing effectiveness, necrotic resistance, and flat health. All these things are nice. This one is wonderful. Then we put all 10 points into the Attunement and Increased Mana Regen, Dedication node. All 10 points please. And then we will put 6 so far into the prayer node. You have increased damage and healing effectiveness if you have healed yourself or an ally recently. Now this is almost always active because with how large the judgment AoE is, you're almost always standing in it as you cast it, so this buff will almost always apply to you. You could easily put all the 10 points into this. I simply didn't to save them for further into the tree. As I get further in levels and finish, maxing out some of these nodes, I'll probably come back and put more in this one as it is very solid. But for now, I just have the 6 points. Then Sanctuary Guardian armor with shield and spell damage with shield. Right now, 5 out of 8 points. Again, this is totally another one that you could fill out completely. In fact, I probably should have moved some points and not gotten carried away with these later ones. But anyways, all is well. Either max this one out or follow what I've done up till this point. Either way, very good node. Put as much in it as you want. Then we take 1 point into Shield Wall. You have a higher chance to block, and you regain health on block, but you cannot dodge. That's fine. We don't build dodge chance, so this is all net positives. Then these last two that I have started dumping points in, we have Reverence of Duality, which is a very small but very nice increase to health, damage, healing effectiveness, and mana. I'm planning to completely fill this out for a, I believe, 24% in all of these stats. This is a wonderful node for just getting a little bit of everything. And then, because I'm a speed addict, I was putting points into Light of Raya, whatever, however you want to say that. Instead of some of these other ones, this gives you increased fire damage, increased lightning damage, and movement speed. Not particularly important. You could probably use these points just as effectively in either of those nodes we talked about earlier, but again, I like movement speed. So I put them in here. I will probably maybe take this to 8, possibly 10 points, depending on how many extra passives I have left. But either way, nice node here, and that one is going to wrap up our Paladin skill tree, our Paladin passive tree. And then just to round out, we will look over my overall stats. As you can see, I'm level 82. Like I said, clearing the level 100 monoliths fairly easily, not having any major issues. It's going swimmingly. I have 45% increased move speed, almost 1200 HP at no buffs going on. I have 80 health regeneration. This moves up closer to, let's see here, 112 base, and then we can double that, get up to 120, and then we got all kinds of other healing effects. So as you can see, lots of healing. You don't die easily. We have 292 mana. This will probably be different from you unless you find exactly the same gear I did, which seems rather unlikely. Without any bonuses going, I'm sitting at 21 mana regeneration. Do try to find as much mana regen as you can, just in case I did not stress that enough in the gear portion. Mana regen will make this whole build, and it makes it a lot more fluid, lets you drop judgment a lot more often. We have 70 attunement. I definitely want to get that higher. I think my friend playing, who's at level 62, 63, something like that, he's already got up to 75 attunement. Mine's a little behind just because of gear, but you want as much of this as possible. I have all of my resistances capped and at least a little overcapped, except for poison, which, as I said and have said before, I don't really have a lot of problems with, especially if I'm running health regen, and on this build especially, because of using the Code of the Erased and having a portion of armor mitigation apply to dot damage. I don't often die to poison, same thing with the last build. If I could squeeze the stats in, I could move things around and get higher poison resist, and I probably should, and I would recommend it. I simply do not, and I'm not worrying about it. We have 58% block chance, 872 block effectiveness for about 43% mitigation. Not bad, especially when combined with other things, and that we block a little over half the time. Again, combined with all the HP regen, we do not fall over easily. And then 3200 armor for a 63% rough mitigation. then we're sitting at a 970 stun avoidance. I do not recall getting stunned very much recently. Once in a while there'll be some big multi-hit or, some big slam that might stun me for a second, but overall, I haven't had an issue with getting stunned. I think this is just fine. But yeah, that just about wraps up anything. I can't think of anything I'm missing going on with this build. It's been a lot of fun. I've been having a great time playing it. It's smooth, it's fast, it does fairly solid damage, it's fairly tanky, so you don't have to worry about everything dropping you all the time and, be on the edge of your seat micromanaging your gameplay. It's a fairly smooth build. I think it's great. I've had a really good time. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the build. I hope you enjoy playing the build if you choose to try and follow in my footsteps with this guy. If you've been playing this or have already tried something with the Hand of Judgment, if there's some hidden tech with this or some little tidbit I didn't mention or don't seem to know about, feel free to drop it down in the comments. I'm always looking to improve my builds. I do tend to kind of drop off playing the build when I usually get a little ways into the level 100 monoliths, as I have so many build ideas that I kind of just play all the way up to about level 80 to 85 and then start a new one. But I would like to go back with this and previous builds and just kind of keep improving them and take them to the max and then do follow-up videos. So long story short, if you notice something that I could improve on heavily with this, don't be afraid to drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. I'm always looking to learn and improve upon my play and builds, so let me know. Thanks so much again for watching, guys. I hope you have a nice rest of your day, and until next time, bye.